Hey, what's up, guys? This is Henry from CTS Podcast, and this week we've got a very special interview with Dr. Benjamin Bikman. For a lot of you, this is probably your first time on the channel. If you'd consider hitting subscribe, liking, sharing, commenting, all of that good stuff, that'd be awesome. Thank you. Hope you guys enjoy. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. This week we've got a special guest on our podcast. He's a family friend, a professor at BYU, and the author of a new book, Why We Get Sick. It's right up there over my shoulder. Dr. Benjamin Bikman, thank you for being on the podcast.
Yeah, my pleasure. Henry, it's fun to see you getting so big, because I remember when we first met about 11 years ago, you didn't have quite as glorious a mustache as you do now.
Yeah, a little bit. I was 8 when we met in Singapore. Yeah. Thank you for being on the podcast. So
My pleasure. Happy to be here.
yeah, so your book, Why We Get Sick, is about, I'll give a little synopsis and then you can describe it better, but it's about insulin resistance and how that ties into a lot of the health issues that we're facing kind of today in our world.
Yeah, this sure does. Yep, that's a good way to describe it. So essentially, it's my thesis in a way, which is to my professional focus is to help people be more aware of this problem, insulin resistance, and they ought to be. It is the single most common health problem in the world. And it's quick to just think, well, these metabolic problems are only relevant to the United States. Not so. That is the very reason why the Singapore government was trying to lure metabolic scientists there, because the problem is so significant throughout Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. So the book, Why We Get Sick, is essentially a description that really outlines what is insulin resistance, where does it come from, why does it matter, and what to do about it.
Yeah. And how did you because insulin resistance, before I read the book, it was something I had never heard of. How did you get kind of turned on to that and get into that?
Yeah, it is an obscure, well, it shouldn't be obscure because it's so common, but it is an obscure field of research, no doubt. Yeah, I wonder as I look back at my career how I stumbled through these decisions to get studying something that matters so much, because there's a lot of really clever scientists, and unfortunately they would have to sometimes admit that what they study doesn't matter much. And I have the good fortune, at least they would probably say the same thing, that it does matter. It all started as a master's student. I was about a year into my master's degree, which in most instances, and it was for me, is no more than a way to bide your time. Most master's degrees in the sciences are simply a way to figure out what you want to do. I can say that unabashedly. I didn't know what I wanted to do. Did I want to go into medicine with my undergraduate degree? Did I want to go into just working into industry, or did I want to stay in academia? And so the master's degree gave me a little time to make that decision. And it was my stumbling on a manuscript that had been published a couple years prior, so that would have been late 90s, that outlined a new phenomenon that is that fat cells, as they grow, become pro-inflammatory. They start secreting these proteins that increase inflammation in the body, and that then increases insulin resistance, which is increasing type 2 diabetes. So this was the great mediator of these twin epidemics of obesity and diabetes. Why are they going up together in all these cultures? Well, it's because of insulin resistance, and it could be because fat cells are promoting inflammation. And so I loved this sequence of events. It was such a nice, neat biochemical series of events of big fat cell increasing inflammation, increasing insulin resistance, then promoting diabetes. So that put me on the path. And then I was fortunate enough to stay on that path during my PhD studies and strengthen that resolve during my postdoctoral fellowship, which was in Singapore. And then the 10 years since I've been my own man, so to speak, as a professor and scientist, I've just kept that going.
That's so cool. And was it something that was known? Was there kind of a body of research about it, or have you kind of been in the last decade been blazing the trail for as far as this subject goes?
Yeah. So it was in its infancy when I was getting my master's degree, and since then, in the past 20 years, has just exploded in research. My contributions have mainly been in the realm of inflammation induced insulin resistance, and now leading more and more into how insulin itself is causing insulin resistance. So, of all the myriad inputs, of all the myriad noxious stimuli that can push the insulin sensitive body or insulin working well to the insulin resistant body or insulin resistant cell, too much insulin is a key driver of that phenomenon. So that's something we've been contributing to, and maybe our most novel contribution recently in the realm of insulin resistance. And again, it is simply that too much insulin is, in fact, a driver of insulin resistance.
Yeah, I'll have to admit, reading the book, it was the first section was a little dire when you go through. You start outlining all the different diseases, and it's just like it's a kind of stand of all the ones you're worried about, right? And it was crazy to read about how linked insulin is. That typically, I mean, for me, and I'm sure for a lot of people, it was more you think about insulin, you think about diabetes, you think about like that's kind of the only time you think
Yep,
about it,
that's
and to
right.
see that it's linked to cancer, to just all these different like heart disease, all these different things was pretty shocking.
Yeah. So, in fact, Henry, that is such a persistent view of insulin. That's why I didn't name the book Insulin Resistance,
Hmm.
Why You Should Care, or something like that, because
Yeah.
no one would care. I knew that if I have the word insulin in there, people will think of diabetes and stop. They will not be aware of the fact that insulin resistance, as you said, is related to certain types of cancers. It's very related to Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia, exquisitely related to heart disease, fatty liver disease, infertility in men and women, and the list goes on and on. Essentially, this is not an overstatement. Every non infectious chronic disease very likely has some connection to insulin resistance at its origin.
Yeah, that was the. I think there's a. You talk about in your book a study that they did on mice with like cognitive, them being able to. They were going through a maze. I think was what you talked about, and it was really eye opening to be like, oh wow, like I never would have thought that because it's really easy to go, okay, like that makes like the first step where you go, okay, that makes sense. Insulin, like getting healthier, like your body's healthier, but to see that it like affects the mind as well, that was really eye opening to me.
Yeah. I'm glad to hear that. In fact, and Henry, I would imagine, now, I don't know exactly what your audience is, but let's just assume that there's a certain population that are younger people. This is the kind of thing that a young person listens to and would shrug off. If we were only keeping the conversation relevant to diabetes, type 2 diabetes, anyone who's in their early 20s ish would just think, oh, well, that's not something I'm worried about. But
Hmm.
when you begin to learn that the most common form of infertility, even in men in their 20s, is erectile dysfunction, and that insulin resistance is a key driver of erectile dysfunction, well, that's a concern, even for
Yeah.
the young guys. The fact that Alzheimer's disease can be detectable in the brain with reduced brain glucose use in people in their early 30s, which is you're not too far from that,
Yeah.
it's just a decade away. It helps put things in perspective that this is not a concern only of the aged individuals. This is something that starts in the 20s in a very serious way. In fact, there's a study in young women in their 20s found that even in these women who were of normal body weight, those with insulin resistance had detectable, albeit slightly, lower levels of cognition. There was a slight degree of cognitive decline. So we need to fight the fight, and we need to start earlier than later.
Yeah, that's definitely you. It's easy to, as a younger person, to be like, oh, well, this doesn't apply to me until later in life. But yeah, that's definitely good to know that you should start now. And what are, I guess, some ways that people, you like for younger people that primarily our audiences can start doing that, start working on that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm very, very glad to be able to provide some insight to this kind of audience. Uh, we have to change the food we eat. That is the absolute elephant in the room. There are other inputs into causing insulin resistance, but the more a person is eating a diet that is pushing their insulin levels up incessantly, the more the body's going to become resistant to that insulin, and then all of the chronic diseases start to follow very, very shortly. So the best thing to do is to keep insulin as low as often as you can. So keep insulin low as often as you can. And then, of course, that begs the next question, well, how do we keep it low? Well, we have to understand the influence on insulin of the three macronutrients. So in all animals' diet, there are three macro or big nutrients: carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Fat alone will have no effect, a negligible effect on insulin, if any. Protein alone can have a modest effect on insulin, and there are some other variables that will dictate the magnitude of insulin effect. Then when you have pure carbohydrate, there's a substantial effect on insulin. If you have equal number of calories of all of these macronutrients, fat will do nothing. Protein may increase insulin 2 times or 3 times, depending on other variables. Pure carbohydrate will increase it 10 times. And it'll stay elevated for up to 2 or 3 hours. So you can imagine someone who is waking up in the morning. They haven't eaten for 10 hours or so, at least. I would say hopefully closer to 12 hours. That would be one takeaway already. Give yourself at least a 12-hour break from food every night. If you eat your last meal at 7 p.m., then try not to eat anything until 7 a.m. Maybe that'd be too easy. Kids are going to eat later into the evening, but whatever it is, slide that timeline accordingly. Try to give yourself 12 hours. Insulin has come down overnight, giving the body a break from the insulin, and the body's become more insulin sensitive accordingly. But the tragedy is, among most people, certainly college-aged kids, we break that fast by eating 2 bagels or 3 bowls of cereal, a big glass of orange juice, or 2 or 3. In other words, pure shite, to put it bluntly. And so insulin has gone up 10 times. And because it was an insulin spiking breakfast, you will be hungrier sooner. That's based on a human clinical study. The more you spike your insulin for breakfast, the hungrier you will be sooner. So 2 or 3 hours later, before your insulin has even had a chance to come back down, you bump it back up with a starchy, sugary mid-morning snack. And then you do the same for lunch, your afternoon snack, your dinner, your evening snack. Every waking moment is spent in a state of elevated insulin, driving insulin resistance and all the problems that come with it, including substantial weight gain, because insulin promotes weight gain. So what to do? Back to the solution after I continue to just describe the problem. I would say change breakfast and change it tomorrow. I already mentioned trying to give yourself a 10-hour fast every night. And then when you do eat breakfast, whenever that is, whether it is in the morning, or whether it's lunch, maybe you fast through breakfast and just drink, say, a cup of tea or something else, then let it be something that won't spike your insulin. So whatever your first meal of the day is, let it be based on proteins and fats, which are essential. There's no such thing as an essential carbohydrate. Literally zero, full stop. That doesn't mean we can't eat them, but why base our entire diet on the one macronutrient that's not essential to humans? So base whatever your first meal of the day is, whenever you eat it, whether it's in the morning or at lunch, focus on protein and fat and eat a lot of it. And then let that be your biggest meal of the day, and then taper down. So the dinner is relatively smaller than that. And then hopefully you don't eat anything in the evening. I know for college-aged kids that's very hard, but try to let it be tapering down. And the later it gets, try to not spike your insulin so that you can really enjoy bed with low glucose levels and low insulin levels. Now, Henry, having said all that, I will add that I, to this day, as a middle-aged man, struggle with the habits that I developed as a college-aged student, and specifically cold cereal or cereal. I, to this day, if we have cereal in the house and it's evening, because when I was a college-age kid, I would eat 2 big bowls of cereal every night. Every night. I am still, 20 years later, trying to get over that temptation, because when I was 22 or 23, no problem. I could do that. I was so active. I was very mobile. I was up and about, very insulin sensitive. Now that I'm 43, almost 44, I can't get away with that as much as I used to. And yet I still feel that I literally can't have cereal in the house in the evenings, because if it's
Mm-hmm.
there, it will take a Herculean effort on my part. Even with all my knowledge, Henry, I know exquisitely well what's going to happen. I can imagine every biochemical process making my fat cells grow, hurting my brain's ability to use glucose for energy, not allowing the brain to tap into ketones because I'm not making any. I know everything, and that falls at the feet of this addiction that I started as an undergraduate because cereal is just so damn good.
Yeah, that's almost the biggest takeaway I had from reading your book was like starting habits now, getting into that mindset before it's kind of too late to yeah, it's
Yep.
really hard to break
Yep.
habits
Where it's
and that
much harder. Yep.
exactly.
So
Yeah.
you guys, these college age kids focus on eggs and meat. And eggs are so affordable. Even on a college budget, a student budget, you can get eggs all the time. And eggs are God's most perfectly packaged little mix of protein and fat. Eat that yolk, eat that egg white. You can cook it up, you can bake with it. I mean, there's so much you can do. Eggs are so versatile. So if you're trying to find a way to get good protein and fat, just get some eggs.
Yeah. That was eggs are definitely. It was cool at the end of your book. You had the list of all the different foods and what should you should be eating. I thought that was like super useful because I've read books before similar that talk about all these things and you get, oh, these are all the problems it caused. Like these are the benefits of changing what you do, and then it's like, well, what do I change? Like how exactly do I change it? So I really appreciated that, and also the fact that the book was so like digestible. It was easy to read, made it like a lot for me specifically. It made it a lot easier to get through my head and a lot more. I don't know. It's is difficult to take like a nonfiction thing, like such a complex topic, and break it down. And I thought you did a fantastic job
No, I'm glad to hear
of
that. In fact,
that.
it's funny. It's funny for you to say that because it is without a doubt my exposure to undergraduates that has helped me learn to um, be more accessible in this kind of material. And I really mean it. There is a challenge to presenting ideas to young undergraduate students, all the more nowadays where the professor has to constantly be competing with social media. At any moment in my class of 2 hours, I know that a student is going to be twitching their thumbs to try to switch over to Instagram or Facebook or something like that. And so you have to not only present the material in an accessible way, but also in a pretty engaging way to keep the student connected. And very much that played into my writing. It has formed my communication even now in real time, but also most certainly in my writing with the book.
Yeah. One question I did have, and this is just I don't know if you don't have any insight on this, but recently I was looking at some studies about different areas in the world that have like long lifespans, like super low levels of all of those, and thinking about like Okinawa, Japan, where they have a diet that's primarily carbohydrates. They like 70% of their diet's like sweet potatoes, 12% rice, and what is that? Is there like good carbohydrates, or is that just a function of moderation? Or I don't know if you have
Yeah.
insight on that.
Yeah, I sure do. Yep, I most certainly do. Yeah, so absolutely not all carbs are created equal. Absolutely. And the more um, original the carbohydrate is, the more nutrients you'll get, and the lower the insulin effect will be. So absolutely, the quality of the carbohydrate matters. Lest anyone be inclined to accuse me of just waging war on all carbs. So that's one very, very important takeaway. And if you measure the fasting insulin in these people, what is their insulin at any given moment? It's very, very low.
Okay.
And so what they're eating and how infrequently they're eating really ends up being quite relevant, which is not a way we eat here in the West, most certainly,
Yeah.
where we're eating all the time. But importantly, there is something to be said for the accuracy of information. Now, Japan is probably an exception to this rule, but there are very famous sites throughout Italy and Greece where they will talk about how long these blue zones, so called, where
Mm-hmm.
people tend to eat lower fat diets and they live into their hundreds. And that idea has been seriously challenged, where more likely than being a reality that these are, in fact, a whole group of centenarians, it is more a matter because paradoxically, these are people that are living into their hundreds in an area or in a country with below normal mortality, or
Yeah.
rather higher than normal mortality, so lower, a shorter lifespan than other countries. And so that's quite a paradox where we have a little pocket of centenarians in what is otherwise a very short-lived country. And the takeaway has been this is all fabricated, actually, that these are communities where there have been no records, there are no birth records among these people. And so, one, you don't actually know the person's age. And two, there's a perverse incentive among some of them to claim they're older than they are so that they can capture government benefits and have retirement or aged benefits earlier. I wish I could recall the source of this information. So I appreciate anyone being skeptical of it. But you could look it up. It was some blue zone controversy, but
Mm-hmm.
essentially it was challenging the dogma of these areas that look at these low fat areas and look how long they live. No, in fact, if anything, it's probably just a phenomenon. It's an artifact of poor record keeping.
Mm-hmm. That's yeah, because I think it was a documentary on Netflix that I saw that looked at a lot of those spaces. So that's good to know that there's might be a little bit of shaky
Oh
information on
yeah, that's
those.
absolutely the case in these areas.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah. So what I'm getting primarily is that we should eggs, very good, something we should focus on. Eggs, protein, and if you are going to eat carbohydrates, make sure they're original and high in nutrients.
As
And then
unprocessed. Yep. So essentially, Henry, what I like to say is fruits and vegetables, eat them, but don't drink them.
mm-hmm,
So, and the more you get into grains, the more problematic things start to become, because we have changed, especially wheat. We have very much changed wheat from what it was about 150 years ago. We have hybridized this plant in our effort to feed more people, which is a very laudable outcome. We have enhanced the starch content. We've enhanced the gluten content, which is a problem for some people, but it makes it easier to bake with. But these are much starchier than they used to be, and we eat it. We eat it very differently. 150 years ago, there was no such thing as quick-acting yeast. And so if you
mm-hmm,
wanted to eat a loaf of bread, you had to use a true sourdough starter. It would always be a little fermented. And our ancestors, before modern refrigeration, and this persists in Asia where there's so much fermented vegetables,
yeah,
you literally had to ferment things to prevent it from spoiling. And so you have this magical combination when it comes to fermented foods. First of all, you only ferment carbohydrates. That's what the bacteria eat. They don't eat fats, they don't eat proteins, they eat starches and sugars. So one, if you fermented the food, the grain in this case to make a fermented bread, or the vegetables, the cabbage, whatever, in Asian cuisine, you have lowered the actual amount of starch that you're going to get because the bacteria have literally already started eating it. And then second, you're getting the bacteria themselves. So you're getting a bit of a probiotic and their metabolic output. So when a bacteria is eating starch, they produce these things called short chain fatty acids. And short chain fats are little fats that really punch above their weight class. They have a tremendous insulin sensitizing effect in the body. So all the more reason to appreciate carbohydrates, but kind of appreciate the wisdom of the ancients, where we think we're so
mm-hmm,
clever with all our processing and preserving and refrigeration, but in the process, we might be mobilizing the metabolic machinery to work against us, whereas our ancestors they dealt with they did they worked with what they had, and
yeah,
that was to keep food lasting. They would ferment it, and I am a huge advocate of fermented foods.
mm-hmm. One thing I did want to ask you, and this gets a little bit away from the insulin resistance specifics, but how would you obviously are extremely passionate about this subject, and you can tell just from speaking to you about it and reading your book. What, as far as advice goes, because I think that's a super awesome quality to have, to find something like that and be super passionate, what advice would you give to people, like younger people maybe just starting out, like about looking for that type of stuff?
Oh gosh, that what a great question, Henry. I appreciate that. So I am very mindful of some of what I consider to be bad advice that we give your generation, which is just do something you love, do what you love. No, that's a great way to generally be poor and without a job that matters. We need to understand the difference between being a productive member of society and a hobby. Those are different things. And so to find something you're passionate about, we need to keep that in perspective. I'm fortunate in that I am passionate about this and I'm able to make a living. But I could have just as easily gone down a different path and probably been just as passionate about that. If I had gone down the medicine path, and I sometimes wonder, man, it would have been really cool to be a pediatric endocrinologist. I'm fascinated by endocrinology, and I bet I would have been just as passionate about that. So more than finding something to be passionate about, it's maybe a matter of having a personality that will allow you to grip into something, to sink your teeth into whatever you're doing and make it matter. Not that you can't pursue something that interests you. You have to pursue something that interests you, but make sure we keep distance, or that it doesn't prevent us from being rational. Because if we have everyone who just pursues nothing but what they're interested in, then we would have a bunch of kids who do nothing but play video games. And that's not going to help, right? That they're going to be miserable, living in their parents' basement, wondering what they did with their lives, but still not having the emotional fortitude to change themselves because it's too late. So we need to really make sure we give your aged generation, the wisdom to appreciate, to discern the difference between what should be a hobby and a passing interest versus what should be your professional aim to provide for yourself and to do something you feel proud of, that you can at the end of the day acknowledge that you've accomplished something. Not that those two can't meet. They certainly can, but they can also meet over time. You can start doing a career that you think, I am going into this militaristically. This is a career. It is going to provide for me and my future family, and I'm going to be a good contributing member of society and have responsibilities to help society and my community. That can turn into a passion. So anyway, back to wrap this long-winded answer up. Have the personality that lets you be aggressive. And in the Bible, it talks about being neither hot nor cold. If you're lukewarm, you're spit out. Don't fall into the trap that so many do nowadays, which is being apathetic or indifferent. No, be fiery, care about something. And where you can, you'll probably find some aspect of your career that'll let you do that.
That's fantastic advice. Thank you for that. So I think we're getting close to our time. Do you want to let the people know where they can find your book, where they can follow if they want more information about your research, where they can get that?
Yeah, you bet. Yeah, thanks, Henry. This is fun. So good to connect with you. I just adore your family. So my book is for sale anywhere books are sold, but Amazon and Barnes & Noble, that's low-hanging fruit, easy place to get. I'm pretty active on social media. About one or two times a week, I try to post a little video, and this is almost like a mini lecture where I'm just sharing some insight into human metabolism or human nutrition, something like that. And people can find me mostly on Instagram. That's where I'm mostly active nowadays, and it's just Ben Bikman, PhD. I'm not as much on Twitter. I mostly just follow Twitter. I'm on Twitter nowadays for college sports updates. It's just not. I just don't find my crowd on Twitter anymore these days. It's becoming too hostile, it seems. And then another area where people can find me, I have a blog that I maintain on a website called Get Health, and health is spelled HLTH. And people can also go there to find more information about an entrepreneurial effort that I'm involved with a couple of my older brothers. We just made a good low-carb meal replacement shake, and people can learn more about it there.
Perfect. Yeah, we'll make sure we'll get all those linked in the description below. So, yeah, guys, check out Why We Get Sick by Dr. Benjamin Bikman. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure, Henry. My pleasure. Thanks, buddy.
Hey, guys, Henry again. Thanks for watching our interview with Dr. Ben Bikman. If you liked what you saw, please consider subscribing, liking, commenting, sharing so we can bring you more things like this. If you want to see another interview that we did, click up here and you can watch an interview that we did with Chris Peterson, the gubernatorial candidate for the Democratic Party in Utah. If you want to see another one of our episodes, click down here. And yeah, thank you guys for watching. See you guys next week.